sure he'll bring you in.
Yeah, well versed for like last-minute crisis conferences and looking for cables.
Yeah, I know. You always have to bring.
Normally the tech person has them in their little drawer.
Good, and then it should be easy. Good. I'm gonna. I teach.
Well, you can tell everyone.
I teach at 1, so I will probably leave during the.
You look like the tech person. You look knowledgeable. I need an HDMI cable because my dongle adjusts to HDMI or an adapter.
I've actually got an adapter to VGA. I know we won't have to do as many switches, so that's not a problem.
Oh, there they are.
Yeah. Usually we don't have this much stuff on this. I've got adapters.
She's the second.
In the morning session?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so.
After the break. So
Oh, after the break? Then we'll check it out. We'll get it all set up at the break. I'll come up at the break.
Oh, is there a break?
We have a 10-minute bathroom break.
Yeah. So I'll be up here, but we've got them ready to go.
Goes in, yeah.
So, all right. Sounds good.
All right. And you can. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's why.
The form for the process fee. Very good. That's what we'll look at. This is the release form for recording.
Okay, you ready, Brian? Okay. Whoops. So we lose a speaker. Good morning. I'm Carla Sinopoli. I am the director of the Museum Studies program here at the University of Michigan, and I am delighted to welcome you to our conference or half-day workshop, Aspiration, Obligation, Imagining Intellectual Freedom in Museums. When we started to talk about this gathering, we had no idea how much more timely the topic of intellectual freedom would become in our nation. So we are very happy to have our speakers here and to have you here, and we know more people will filter in as the morning goes on. This event is actually the brainchild of our Associate Director, Bradley Taylor, and I am going to turn the floor over to him to introduce it and our speakers. So, Brad.
Thanks, Carla. If you've missed them coming in, there are handouts on top of the podium that you can use to guide yourself through the conference today. Greetings and thank you for joining us today. We're delighted to have you with us for a discussion of a topic that seems especially timely but doesn't get a lot of explicit attention in discussions about or writing on museums, and that's the topic of intellectual freedom. We welcome today presenters and panel participants who come from a diversity of professions: libraries, museums, law, digital publishing, and censorship to examine practice, law, ethics, and policy that relate to the topic at hand. Many of our participants have come from a distance, as have many of you, and we're grateful to all of you for the effort, so thank you for coming. Programs such as this don't emerge from thin air and necessarily involve the support, input, and collaboration of many. Allow us to begin today, as is proper, by thanking those whose active support and guidance have made today possible. First of all, deepest thanks to our Museum Studies Program Director, Professor Carla Sinopoli, who shared in the enthusiasm for this topic and has provided generous support and insight over the last year of planning the conference. On campus, we further benefited from conversations with Melissa Levine of the University of Michigan Libraries, Professor Ray Silverman, Professor Karen Markey, all of our presenters and participants, our graduate student assistant Catalina Esquera, and MSP's own Amy Smola. For those of you who know our office well, you know that nothing happens without Amy Smola. So thank you all. That should be for Amy alone. She's that indispensable. So, why a conference on intellectual freedom in museums? Most of us likely assume that the work we do in museums follows from our legal charge as nonprofit tax-exempt organizations to serve the public good. We take comfort in knowing that the work we do has educational merit, can produce important knowledge, better and better represents diverse stakeholders and varied points of view, preserves important collections for future generations, entertains school children and families, even gainfully employs individuals with arts and humanities backgrounds. That's all good. That's all important. Isn't that all public good kind of stuff? Don't we all do amazing things with the limited resources we have? Of course we do. But is it enough? Is it what we're legally mandated to do? Does our work meet ethical responsibilities that we have to the society that entrusts such collections, such work, such opportunity to us as a profession? Intellectual freedom, as codified in the everyday practice of our colleagues in the library field, seeks to assure free and unrestricted access to the physical objects and associated intellectual documentation in library collections. Assuring free and unrestricted access entails a considered, well-articulated, and shared set of beliefs, organizational systems, and practices that include, but are not restricted to, fully cataloged collections, the interinstitutional ability to share and search for information across library collections, a uniform system of cooperative cataloging predicated on standard descriptive languages and documentation formats, procedures for responding to censorship challenges, a national office that provides legal and financial support to frontline librarians facing censorship challenges, and well-articulated policy that is centered on the rights of library users. Policy centered not on things, but on people. And above all, a national policy that codifies these shared values and priorities. These all seem like ideas we could easily get behind and support with some enthusiasm. Libraries aside, what about intellectual freedom in museums? That's what we're here to explore today, because I need to tell you that any mention of intellectual freedom as a concept, intellectual freedom as a mandate, even intellectual freedom as an aspiration is totally, hear me, totally absent in the published policy of the American Alliance of Museums and the International Council of Museums. That should come as a surprise to many of us who assume that this is one of the foundations of our work in museums. At this point, I could easily launch into a recitation of the abrogation of public access rights to museum content across the country, but I'll resist in the interest of time. But such abrogations are a long-standing and deep-seated part of museum practice. The absence of national policy in any of our major museum associations becomes by default an unfortunate reflection on our collective priorities as museums. This is not an art museum issue. This is not a history museum issue. It is not a natural science museum issue. This is an American museum issue. And while I sincerely believe that those of us who have committed their life's work to museums share many of the laudable practices of librarians, we do so without benefit of codified professional policy that sets forth a series of access rights for museum visitors. So, assuming that we share many of the same basic values, let's begin today by seeing how others have accomplished this as a first step in finding our own way forward. To help us begin to explore the parameters of how libraries and censorship organizations have responded to the need for intellectual freedom, we have two excellent speakers to lead the way. To begin with, I'll start with our first speaker, James LaRue. James, or Jamie, is the director of the American Library Association's Office for Intellectual Freedom and the Freedom to Read Foundation. Author of The New Inquisition, Understanding and Managing Intellectual Freedom Challenges, LaRue was a public library director for many years, as well as a weekly newspaper columnist and cable TV host. He has written, spoken, and consulted on leadership and organizational development, community engagement, and the future of libraries throughout his career. It's really great to have you with us. Let's welcome James LaRue.
Hello, everyone. Give me just a moment here to turn on all the devices and make sure that they are still working. The magic of technology. Okay, well, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Brad. And I should say that I was born and raised on the other side of Lake Michigan, Waukegan, Illinois. And I'll begin with kind of the personal values that I think drives many librarians, and I suspect drives many people in the museum community. I was 6 years old, and I was placed way out one summer in right field because I was small and bored and not very good at baseball. And I mean way out in the field, like in Indiana, way out in the field. So far that I didn't actually have to come back at the end of an inning because it would just turn around and walk back out. And I was out there, bored out of my mind, and suddenly I saw on the horizon a blue shimmer glimmering. And I thought, what is this? It got larger and larger and larger until eventually I saw materializing on the horizon a bookmobile. And it pulled up on the edge of the field, and I mesmerized. I walked off the field. Nobody missed me. And I walked over to the bookmobile as the steps came down, and I walked inside this bus filled with books and kind of looking around in amazement. And this is when I saw the first librarian I ever met, Mrs. Johnson, who looked at me and smiled as if I was the man she had been waiting for all of her life. And I have to stop and say, I had been raised in a household, a very verbally abusive father. Every day of my life, I heard, "You are so stupid." Heard this over and over as a child. I want to hasten to say, I didn't believe my father when I heard this. But you get used to hearing this kind of comment. And so as I was looking at Mrs. Johnson, and she smiled at me, she said, "Do you have any questions?" And I said, "I do," because I'd been reading comic books. In fact, I was the only 6-year-old in my block who could spell invulnerable. Okay? And I learned to read from comic books. And I said, I saw this phrase in a comic book, the speed of light. And I thought, How strange. Who thought that light had a speed? I thought it was light or it was dark. Who figured out that light had a speed? And then how did they figure out how fast it was? And then I braced myself. Here it comes. That's so stupid. And Mrs. Johnson, eyes aglow, said, "What a fascinating question. Let's find out." At that moment, that began my love affair with libraries, right? Because that was the first time in my life I learned that there were grown-ups out there who had a fundamental belief in the dignity, essential dignity of human inquiry. It was my first exploration of intellectual freedom. And so began the love affair. So here's a very, very brief history about America's public libraries. And I think it might parallel in some respects what goes on with museums in the United States. So there was a huge movement from 1870 to 1930 of the establishment of public libraries across the United States. And it kind of fell into a couple of waves. But the issue that it was trying to solve was, what do we do with all of these immigrants? There was a flood of immigrants coming into the country, and they were Italians, and they were Greeks, and they were the Irish. And many, many civic leaders said, oh my God, we're going to be overwhelmed by these foreign influences. How do we turn them into Americans? And the answer really was a dual institutional response. The first one was public schools. To say, we'll come in and teach you the history of the nation and kind of pull you all together and make connections so we can all grow up together. And the second one was the establishment of public libraries across the United States. And for a long time, the American libraries community, we were very prescriptive. Our motto was, and pretty officially, was the best books. We figured out which books mattered. We told people which books to buy. For the greatest number, we served as many people as we could to make us all Americans at the least cost. So we were trying to be very efficient about it, very prescriptive. And that meant that at the beginning of America's libraries, we defined collections that were probably 85 to 90% nonfiction. Our assumption was that if you were working all day but you wanted to advance yourself as a good American, you then went to the public library and read about how to become a better machinist. Okay? Or you would say, how do I stay current with the issues of the day? How do I become civically engaged and aware of the issues that matter to American citizens? That was the theory. In practice, what happened was 75% of what everybody checked out was fiction. That after you worked all day at the factory or doing hard work, you came home and you wanted to read a story. You wanted to read something that was sort of fascinating, interesting, and took your mind off of things. Or you wanted to find books for children, because even then, before we had all the research, it was fun to read to kids, and kids fell in love with various books. So at about this time, when we had the emergence of two of the most popular series of fiction ever written, The Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew. Do we have any Nancy Drew fans in the room? Okay. With her roadster. Yes, and Ned, right? And then The Hardy Boys. Any Hardy Boy fans? I remember reading these as a kid. So it turns out that America's librarians, almost without exception, were violently opposed to these series. They were not serious. Later on, they were found to have racist sort of tinges to them. And yet, if you talk to anybody who read Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys, they were mostly filled with excitement and positive and can-do sorts of ideas and a sense of exploration. So this was the first disconnect. We thought that we were teaching people to be better citizens by reading the nonfiction of the day, but in fact, we were building America by creating shared dreams and aspirations, mostly through fiction, mostly through aspiration. And I was also intrigued by this. Sometimes as a public library director, I would on occasion run afoul of the county commissioners or various local folks because we were having rousing discussions about issues of the day at the library, and people would say, that's not the job of the library. But the truth is, since the very beginning, back in the subscription library times under Ben Franklin, people got together to argue about important matters at the public library. We have always been a place where big debates took place. But I want to make it clear, we were talking about serious matters. Librarians were serious. Then came a tipping point. And I was talking about this last night with some folks, and I believe that museums may now be at a tipping point that is very similar to where we were. In 1938 in Des Moines, there was a public library director named Forrest Spaulding. And he began to notice that there was a rise in anti-immigrant sentiment, anti-Semitic, anti-Catholic, and more challenges were coming to the library to say, we don't like seeing these people in the library. We don't like the books that we're finding here. Can't we do something about it? And so Forrest Spalding, who was at that point a member of the American Library Association, which was founded in 1876, he was one of the first people to build something called an Intellectual Freedom Committee, to say, let's start talking about these issues of censorship and about openness of library collections to everybody, about trying to represent not just the best books, but a good sample of what people are actually talking about. Intellectual Freedom Committee. And so he drafted something he called the Libraries, a Libraries Bill of Rights. Took it to his trustees and said, let's adopt this. And then in 1939, took that back to the American Library Association and said, we think that this should be a fundamental principle of librarianship, not just a personal value, but something that may define our role in society. And so after not very much debate, the American Library Association adopted the Library Bill of Rights. And this was the beginning of America's commitment, our librarian commitment, to intellectual freedom as a fundamental value of the profession. And to give you kind of a quick definition, what do I mean by intellectual freedom? The right to speak, write, express, and the right to access the speech, writings, and expressions of others. That's it. So here is kind of the current slide. So the very first one was that the idea that books and other library resources should be provided for the interest, information, and enlightenment of all people, the community. And the key one was this: materials should not be excluded because of the origin, background, or views of those contributing to their creation. At about that time, Des Moines got its first big organized censorship challenge against the work of a rising German nationalist, a populist who had become very, very popular in Germany. The book was Mein Kampf. And it was an extraordinary push to get the book off the shelves because it echoed many of the anti-Semitic things that were happening in the nation at the time. And many years later, Spalding said, rather than trying to remove the book, if people in our community had read it, we might have not been so surprised to discover what in fact was happening in Germany at that time. The second, was that libraries should provide materials and information presenting all points of view. So moving away from this prescriptive idea to say that anyone who has questions could come into the building and expect to find broad representation, even controversial views, straight across the board to say if somebody comes in and argues strenuously for one thing, we don't decide as a community we all agree. We say, but what do other people say? What else are folks talking about? And then the idea is that material should not be proscribed or removed because of partisan or doctrinal disapproval. And I was a public library director for almost 27 years in Colorado. And in that time saw over 250 challenges. So let me make this very, very clear. One of the examples we had is somebody came in one day and saw in a very conservative community in Castle Rock, Colorado, saw a copy of Al Franken's book, and I think it was Lies and the Lying Liars Who Tell Them, right? And this person got very, very upset because she was a dyed-in-the-wool Republican and said, where are Ann Coulter's books? And I said, here's how we actually play out the Library Bill of Rights in practice. We bought a copy of Ann Coulter's book. We bought a copy, I think it was, none dare call it treason, but something like that. Why Liberals Have No Brains, something like that. So we bought Ann Coulter's book, we bought Al Franken's book, and then there were suddenly many more demands for Ann Coulter's book than for Al Franken. So we bought 5 more copies of Ann Coulter's, and all of them were checked out. And so the appearance of bias, you're promoting Al Franken, was that, no, poor lone Al is here all by himself because all the popular books are checked out. So we begin with the notion we present both sides, but the number of materials that you have in a community are based upon the community demand. So we respond to the community, but there's still a commitment to making sure that there's some balance of collections. And the third one was this idea, an explicit responsibility on the part of libraries, that for the first time we articulated the principle is we were obliged to oppose censorship, and that we needed to reach out and find other allies. And an example of how this plays out, again in Colorado there was a school library, and they were teaching the book called Bless Me Ultima. and sort of a Hispanic magic realism sort of thing. And one day the principal was walking down the hallway. The box of books had just arrived. He was taking them to the English class for instruction. Happens to meet a woman in the class walking down the hallway, a parent. And she said, "I can't believe that you bought this book. It violates, look, on page 52, it violates our free speech code. Somebody's swearing in this book. We don't allow swearing in the school, so we need to get rid of this book." He went, "Oh, I guess that makes sense." And she said, "Well, I'll get rid of them for you." Took the box of books and took them to the dump and threw them away. And so I wound up afterwards. Then, of course, they discovered that this had happened, and this poor principal was pilloried in the local newspaper by not following any of the fundamental principles through which we ensure there's a thoughtful reconsideration of challenges to materials. We must resist censorship. Fourth, fifth, and sixth, that's the whole thing, is that first we should cooperate with other persons and allies, and we have many allies out there. ACLU, National Coalition Against Censorship. There is a whole host of organizations who constitute what I think of as the intellectual freedom community. So when museums join us, you are joining a vast community that stretches all the way around the world. And then fifth is a person's right to use the library should not be denied or abridged because of origin, age, and I'll have a story about that in a minute, background or views. And then finally, we realize that libraries increasingly are not just about books, not just about collections. We're also spaces in which conversation happens. And this is the spot where we have greater overlap with the museum community in terms of exhibit spaces and meeting rooms. So our notion here is that we have to be equitable. If we make them available to anybody, we have to make them available to everybody under the same terms. And there are lots and lots of interpretations. So here's my second story after Mrs. Johnson. So I was a public library director in Colorado. And one day a homeschooling family comes through the library, and it's the mother, Susie and Johnny, and they all grab their books and go up to the circulation desk and set their books up. And as the clerk starts to check things out, the mother reaches over and she says, "Johnny, we've talked about this. There are no dinosaurs in the Bible. I don't want you reading about these." She picks up the book and hands it to the clerk and says, "You can't check out this book." Clerk takes the book, puts it on a cart to be shelved. And the next day, Johnny comes back all by himself. Same book, same clerk. And Johnny hands the book to the clerk. The clerk checks it out and sees me and comes over and says, "Which time did I do the wrong thing?" Which time? Neither, right? Neither. And so what that means is, so I said, "Okay, let's walk that through. Johnny, you can't have this book." What is the clerk supposed to say? "Oh, yes, he can." We believe that you have the freedom to check out what you want, but we're not going to place ourselves as a government employee between the parent and the child. Okay? That's their business. We don't interfere. But when Johnny comes back the next day, it's all hands on deck. He has the right to express intellectual curiosity. We do not act in loco parentis, in place of the parents. We check out the book. So I said, "I think you did the right thing both times." Well, the next day, Johnny's parent, mother, comes back all by herself with the book, and she said, "I told you I didn't want him to have this book. I can't be with Johnny every second of the day." And she says, "Well, ma'am, if he comes in by himself, we're going to check out books to him." And she said, "Fine, then I will take his library card." Does she have that right? She does. So she took the library card. All of us were kind of depressed about that. And the next day, Johnny comes back again, all by himself, and sits down in the library with Danny and the dinosaur and starts to read. And the clerk comes up and says, "What should we do?" I said, "Leave him the hell alone." Right? This is one of the places, libraries may be, and museums, one of the few places left in American society where a child can be undisturbed, can be left alone to think and to study. And so this idea about a personal value, I believe in the right to ask questions. Libraries responded to me. Even when you're taking a look at things that may be controversial, this is one of our roles in society, one of the few institutions that honor the freedom of inquiry in every mind. Okay, whoops. See if I can get back to my other, there we go. So I've talked about minors. So now what happens, let's say that you decide you want to take this principle that probably drove you into museums in the first place, a curiosity, the desire to ask questions, even uncomfortable questions, even look at moments in the historical record that are difficult or emotional or, upset people because you are curious. How do you begin to move that personal value into an institutionalized form so it becomes part of the fundamental fabric of museums? And so for us, when we adopted this Library Bill of Rights, we said, okay, just as the First Amendment, which is the beginning of free speech in the United States, has lots and lots of new interpretations that come up through court cases, so too, we have the Library Bill of Rights, and we have something that are called interpretations. So various committees that I'll get to in a moment gather each year and say, okay, so now we have transgender people seeking bathrooms. What does the Library Bill of Rights say about that? Well, one option is you go back and you keep changing the Library Bill of Rights, but we quickly realize that just as you don't go back and amend the First Amendment every time a new challenge comes to it, you interpret it. Some years ago, again back in Colorado, there was a local group that managed in push through a state constitutional amendment that removed civil liberties for gays, lesbians, and transgendered people. Removed anti-discrimination laws of various kinds. And so as a consequence, a lot of people said, okay, well then fine, we're not going to have our conference in Colorado. We're going to boycott Colorado. And a group of librarians said, we need to go back and specifically put LGBT rights in the Library Bill of Rights. And then we realized if we had done that, the Library Bill of Rights, which has been adopted by almost every public library board across the country, would have suddenly taken a look at that and said, I don't know if I agree with that, and might have rejected it. And so instead we said, rather than change the Library Bill of Rights, let's issue an interpretation saying it's already there. We meant it. It is included. The Library Bill of Rights was written very, very broadly, and the latest test still ensures openness and inclusion to all points of view, all backgrounds, all views. And then somewhere around 1967, I have to acknowledge my predecessor. The Office for Intellectual Freedom was founded in 1967. I am only its third director. Judy Krug, known to many, was the one who established this, and she held the position for 35 years. So I applied because the job doesn't open up that often. You got to grab it when it does. And while she was there, the Office for Intellectual Freedom established in 1967, the Freedom to Read Foundation, which is sort of the litigation arm. It's a separate 501c3, but it exists to take these free speech issues that relate to libraries to the courts. And we've had some very, very high-profile cases in which we defend the rights of students in schools to have access to content. The rights of libraries to challenge the Patriot Act. If there's a gag order that is placed on libraries, librarians stand up and say, we think that's absolutely outrageous. And so this is one of the ways that we defend the First Amendment and the Library Bill of Rights in practice. And then the other thing is that I know that we have the American Library Association, so all of us can build our resumes. So all of us can get together and talk about the ways that the profession makes sense to us and discuss the issues of the day. And when you start to establish committees, the committees start to put together programs. And so one of the ways that we did this was to say the Intellectual Freedom Committee, IFC, I mentioned already predates the Office for Intellectual Freedom, goes quite a ways back. We have an Intellectual Freedom Roundtable, less formal, a way for new members in the library field to get connected. We have a Committee on Professional Ethics where we try to define again that intellectual freedom is not just a nice separate statement adopted that's somewhere off to the side. It is a fundamental professional responsibility where we identify intellectual freedom as a specific requirement of a new librarian. And again, once you have conferences, once you have committees, they start to build some expertise, and you begin to have a cadre of leadership that gets more and more articulate about this principle, and it raises the profile within the profession. So that's something that I can strongly recommend as one of our strategies. So now let's move into, so we've built, you have personal values. You have a library bill of rights. You have various committees within an association that are talking about this and trying to articulate it, embed it within the profession. How then do you really defend intellectual freedom within your profession? And so I think it really has come down to two things. There are policy and procedure. And so among the policies, the first one is institutional mission. All of us have them. And so what many libraries have done is to go back and say, so how have we called out the responsibility of intellectual freedom in our foundational documents? And so this idea about know who you are. Whenever libraries come into conflict and we purchase a book or we have a controversial exhibit, somebody says, no, 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 the job of the library is to protect the young. You say, no, that's not the job of the library. The fundamental responsibility of the library is this. We gather, organize, and present to the community the intellectual content of our culture. It's about access. It's not about protection. It's about exposure. It's about the ability to have a chance to investigate the evidence of our culture yourself to make up your own mind. If you do not have a clear statement of your purpose in public life, anyone else is more than happy to come in and do it for you. To redefine it on the fly, to incorporate, to appropriate your institution to their own private agenda. So declare the responsibility to present many views and to resist censorship. Be mindful of it. Build it into the institution's mission, because then it's much easier to defend it. The second one is, I trust this is very similar in the museum world to what happens in libraries, and that's a collection development policy. Why do we buy what we buy? And our notion here is just to articulate in the broadest possible terms the materials that we add are meant to do various things, to reflect current topics, to reflect ongoing consensus, to expose issues of the day and controversies, to explore different perspectives. Call it out. Again, if it's in policy, it becomes much easier to defend things later. And then when we started talking about exhibits, we would lay out the goals of exhibits, so a specific policy to govern what we exhibit and why. Again, it's to support the mission of our institution. And we typically include this statement to say we're presenting things, we're not endorsing things. And so if we put out a controversial thing, again, one of the ones that I was discussing last night, saw a fascinating, kind of a traveling exhibit that ALA did, which was about racist imagery in posters. And among those posters were things from World War II, where we showed the racist portrayals of the Japanese people. And we had many, many people who were angry about that, Japanese residents in our area, who came up and they said, this is outrageous. We said, it absolutely is outrageous. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the historic record and what that means. And we could point to, we were presenting history. We were exposing some of the behavior of America that deserves some thoughtful consideration. After exhibits, we talk about programs. Why are, again, same kind of idea. What are we trying to do? How does it fit the issue of our goals? And if we have a program, we're not endorsing the message of the program, it's an opportunity for us to discuss it. Same thing with meeting rooms. And I imagine that's true for museums in the same way that it would be true for a library, which is that staff drafts basic policy, and then you sit down with your board to discuss this, to give them a heads up about it, to say why it is that you need it, and then the board adopts it. And I'll just jump in and tell you one more thing here. Here's what we've learned. In those libraries in the United States that do not have that policy infrastructure, they are far more likely to have books removed. It's just a fact. Absent an infrastructure of policy, it's like being a jewelry store that doesn't bother to lock your doors at night. You're going to get hit. Okay? And so this is step one, adopt the policy. Do I have time for a story? I do. There's always time for a story. So this is, some years ago, I had my acquisition person who called me and said, I know that many of these challenges come to you, Jamie, so I wanted you to know that there has been a shift in the publishing world. And so here's the brief history of romance novels. Once upon a time, there was Harlequin. There was a chaste kiss and a proposal at the end. Then there were somewhat steamier relations, where things were heating up much sooner. And then there were fairly steamy things where people were having sex by page 5. So I didn't know about some of these things because, as my acquisitions person said, they're never on the shelf. They have been requested before the books have been published. There's a long waiting line when the book shows up. The people that are reading them read them and return them, and they're constantly on hold until finally the book falls apart from use. No one complains about it because it was never on the shelf. It was in constant motion. She said, now, but there has been a change. And, you know, instead of the bare-chested man and the woman with décolletage spilling out on the front cover, now there are two bare-chested men and a woman with décolletage in the middle. Ménage à trois. Now, the men are having sex on page 5, and they introduce a young woman by page 30. And I thought, I have got to get out more. I did not know that this was like a thing in the publishing world. And I looked at this, and I looked at our policies, which says we buy what people request. We buy what is positively reviewed. These were positively reviewed. And so I contacted my board to say, you know, there's a shift in the publishing world. This is before 50 Shades of Grey. And I think that the board needs to know that that's happened. So we've got these Ménage à Trois books, and I would like to present them to you so you can read them and know that your community is requesting them. Give your board a heads up about the potentially controversial issues that are coming their way. And I will say the delightful thing is we had lunch once a month where I would have a chance to talk about things, and I said, and people didn't always come to the lunch. But I said, I'll be distributing these books at our lunch, and every board member was there. So again, the point of policy is to think things through before the controversy hits, give your board a heads up, adopt a stance, and my board wound up saying, okay, we read these through, and they're very formulaic, and it turns out that sexual explicitness has changed in America, but under our policies, it seems to us that we are obliged to purchase this content. And so now when the challenge comes, we understand it. We're ready for it. Oh, request for reconsideration. This is the second thing that I want to highlight, and that's that there is a tendency in controversial moments to fold under pressure. Every institution faces this. So how do we deal with it? And so what we have learned in the library world is that there needs to be a very distinct protocol about how this is to be managed. And the idea is that when there is a challenge, by which I mean nothing more than an attempt to remove or restrict access to a particular exhibit, library service, material, you say, okay, first let's talk about how best to respond in the moment. And because we have this policy in place, we also have in the library world lots and lots of training. How do we respond in the moment? And I'll tell you the very best one that I've heard is that, yes, there's policies, and yes, we can speak the language of anti-censorship. But the very best thing that I found is that it was modeled for me by one of my librarians years ago. A patron walks in and has a book and slams it on the desk in front of her and says, "This book is filth." And the library manager, without breaking a sweat, turns around, grabs a book off the hold shelf, sets it down next to it and says, "And this one's worse." And so rather than getting into an argument about defending censorship, you know, anybody here ever been a member of a book club? What's the most boring book club? Is one where everybody agrees and they like the book, right? And so it's far, far better if somebody comes in and says, "I hate this book," or "I hate this exhibit," to say, "I kind of like that book," or "I kind of like that exhibit." Or to say, "Yeah, I hated it too." It doesn't have to be removed. It doesn't have to be restricted. It's there for us to talk about. And so in the case of the person who said, "Yeah, this one's worse," they could bond over the book, and by the end the person says, "Okay, put me on hold for that book too." Right? So training about how to respond to customer complaints, to build the relationship, to build the conversation, is one of the ways you embed the value of intellectual freedom into an institution. But let's say that the person doesn't buy it. They say, "Okay, now I want to do something about this book." And so, okay, now it's not just a complaint that we fold. Here is the form that we use to record your complaint. Tell us what upset you about it. Be as specific as you can. Did you read the whole book? Did you walk through the whole exhibit? What is it specifically that concerns you? Once that happens, a request for reconsideration process means you give it to, in most cases, a committee. And that committee would be For a library, we would say, okay, let's take a manager of a different branch, let's take one member of the community, let's take somebody from the acquisitions department, and they sit down and they test the complaint, read it through, consider it thoughtfully, and say, how does this compare with our policy? Does the book that we bought fit into the things that we said? Is it factual, or is it modern, or has it received positive reviews, or does it generally speaking reflect the role of the library? And then they make a recommendation that comes back to the director. The director then says, okay, they decide. And they respond in writing to the person who made the complaint, and they cite the mission of our institution, our policy, the recommendation that came to me on the basis of the review. In other words, it provides a system in which intellectual freedom has a chance to play out thoughtfully, mindfully, instead of folding in the moment of a point of controversy. And sometimes they may offer an appeal to the board, and I've got enough time to walk through one of these cases. So in one case, there was a library patron who came in and found a children's book and said, this book, Princess Buttercup. And Princess Buttercup was about little fairies, and Princess Buttercup is a fairy, and it's her birthday, and she gets together with other princess fairies, and they're going to have a birthday party. And the short version is she goes off looking for party favors, gets lost in the woods, finds a butterfly, the butterfly brings her back, happy ending. But there was one page where Princess Iris was lazy. She didn't want to do anything. And so instead of preparing for the party, she just wanted to play a game. And they showed Princess Iris throwing a little berry into a spider web net instead of doing anything. What's the problem? Princess Iris was a fairy of color, the only brown-skinned fairy in the book, who was lazy and who was playing basketball. And so the woman who was complaining about the book, herself a woman of color, said, I'm bringing my biracial daughter into the library to read this. Do you have any idea how powerful and destructive this stereotype is to young minds? And so I took a look at this. So the complaint came to me as director. I said, is it racist? Yeah, I think it probably is. And so I actually took the step of writing to the publisher to say, you have a reputation as a publisher as being very inclusive, very aware of these sorts of views. What were you thinking? And was this a decision that was made on the part of the author or a decision made on the part of the illustrator? And having received this complaint, could you help me respond to this? Because I would like to be able to speak about this to the person complaining. I never heard from the publisher. And so I sat down and I read this and I said, on the one hand, I'm inclined to agree with the person who's making the complaint, but I am disinclined to withdraw the book, because if I do that as an establishing a principle where the library now must remove books that show racial stereotypes, there's not much left. There's not much left. And so better to call it out and talk about it than to remove the evidence altogether. So I wrote to the woman and I said, I hear you, I understand, but I'm going to keep it, and here's why. You have the right to appeal to the board. And she said, I will appeal to the board. So she came to the board, and my board did something quite wonderful. They said, okay, first, that goes to the top of the agenda. We have a person who's about to complain. Jamie, as director, can you give us the summary? I summarized. Said, so you made this decision. Ms. Smith, would you stand up and speak to us, please? And she spoke up, very articulate, spoke to the power of stereotypes, the great power of literature, and that we were failing in our mission to educate our community. And so then the board, one by one, went through and said, okay, we hear you, read the book, have thought about it, are very sympathetic to you, but no, we've decided to retain the title. Except my last board member said, I agree with her. I think we should have gotten rid of this. And so the board decided to retain it, and they said, is there anything else you'd like to say? And I said, yeah, I write a newspaper column, and I'd like to write about this for our community. I'll write a newspaper article about it, and then I would like to give my column to Mrs. Smith for the next week so she can write about it, so our community can talk about it. We can see various aspects about this book. She accepted that challenge. She did write about it. There were a couple of letters to the editor about it. But then my board member said, at the end, Ms. Smith, how were you treated today? And she said, well, I don't agree with you, but I understand why you reached your decision. It was very thoughtful and it was respectful. Flash forward 6 months, we had a board opening. My board president invited her to apply. She applied, she was appointed. She eventually became the library board president, and I had the great pleasure of watching defend the library against censorship when somebody came in and asked for a book to be removed. Flash forward another year, she's walking through a bookstore with her daughter, and her daughter says, "Oh, Mommy, look, I found that book." And she goes, "Oh, God, here it is." Turns to the page, and now Princess Iris, instead of being lazy, was contributing to the party by creating a game. Changed the publisher. The publisher changed his mind. The publisher changed the book. A far more interesting and nuanced story, a far better example of how to treat people with complaints and how to recognize that the publishing world around us, the world of ideas around us, is also in constant flux, and we need to engage with it. So when a challenge goes to the board, they review the previous steps, and a board's decision is final. So that outline of a request for reconsideration policy, requests for reconsideration, are among the best ways that I would suggest museums embed intellectual freedom into their institutions. Once you get into this, you start creating published works. And so just the quick commercial part of our program, we have created the Intellectual Freedom Manual, the 9th edition, in which we detail in very specific form, here's how you create a policy. Here's how you adopt it. These are the emerging issues. Here's how you address internet access. Here's how you respond to managing various public complaints. And now, another story, getting close. Darby, Montana is a community of 4,000 people, very white, very homogeneous, and mostly a ranching community. And this wonderful woman here in the lower center here, Wendy Hamilton, was the public library director, and she says, you know, I have to figure out a way to bring the world to this community. That we tend to be very insular, and let's open things up. So she teamed up with the local Humanities Council. Let us hope that Humanities Councils endure in the days to come. And she first brought in an African-American cowboy. And he talked about what it was like to be a cowboy in Montana, and that was very well received. Then brought in a Chinese-American who happened to, his family had been in Montana, had laid the trails for the railroad, and talked about what it was like growing up and dealing with various changing attitudes about the Chinese. And then they announced an Islamic perspectives, where this gentleman in the lower right-hand corner was an Arabic language professor at one of the universities. And so we're going to talk about Islamic perspectives. A returning veteran from Afghanistan became very, very upset about this. And so he said, you know, these people are trying to destroy America. We cannot allow proselytization to happen here in Darby, Montana. So we stood outside the library, started agitating, got people to do protests, do petitions. And Wendy then got together with these 7 people ultimately and said, come talk to our board. What are your concerns? And listened to them and said, well, we hear you, but we're not trying to proselytize. We're not Islamic. We just don't know very much about it. And one of the ways we talked about this was to say, what's the difference between a Catholic and a Protestant? And these 7 people say, well, Catholics believe in the Pope and Protestants don't. And say, okay, what's the difference between Sunni and Shia? Say, well, we don't know. And say, that's why we're having the program. It's educational. We're trying to learn more about things we don't know very much about. Well, that did not satisfy the 7. They went away. But the board says, we're going to continue. And Wendy did something very smart. She called the various librarians in the area. She called the sheriff's department. She called the fire department. She called the Office for Intellectual Freedom. And so her tiny library, upper left-hand corner, held, I think it was 150 people total. And so on the advice of the fire department, she cleared out the library at 5:30 for the 7 o'clock program, generated 150 tickets, said we're going to give these on a first-come, first-served basis at 6:30, stepped outside, and at 6:30 there were 500 people waiting to get into the program. Didn't know how many of them might be protesters, how many were just showing up to listen. But there had been a lot of advanced PR through the newspaper. So they handed out the 150 tickets, and did something very smart. Wendy sent her board members out there to meet each of the people standing outside, eye to eye, holding a tray full of coffee and cookies, and saying, thank you so much for showing up today. Have a cookie. have a cup of coffee, made eye contact, and said, we're sorry we can only take 150, but we put speakers so you'll be able to at least listen to this from the outside. 150 people came in. Wendy handed out comment cards. She said, as you listen to our speaker and you have questions, write your questions down and we'll pass those forward and we'll answer all of your questions at the end. And so this is a technique to prevent people from standing up and shouting at the speaker, but a legitimate way to honor their questions and to ask the difficult questions. So then Wendy stands in front of them all and she says, a moment captured in that photograph, welcome to the Darby Community Public Library. We're here today to educate ourselves. We're here today to learn, and I will not lie to you. You're going to hear things about a religion that we don't know very much about. But here in America, land of the free, you are free to believe anything you please. No one can tell you what you have to believe. And here in America, home of the brave, we're not afraid of new ideas. We're Americans. We're ready to learn. We're ready to listen. And here in Montana, we have a reputation of Western hospitality. So please join me in welcoming our speaker. Well, notice the beauty of this. We have framed shared values. We have framed the things we hold in truth together. This is how we're going to behave. This is how you become the only adult in a room. To frame things in terms of respect and civil and civic discourse. Or as my daughter says, free speech worth listening to. Okay? And so he got up and he spoke, and then the questions were taken, and they were difficult questions. Doesn't it say in Islam that you shall kill the infidel? He says, well, it says you shall kill the infidel who invades your country. That's a little different. Lots and lots of conversation. It ran 2 hours long. At the end, Wendy stands up, join me in thanking our speaker, round of applause. And he says, no, join me in thanking our librarian who made it possible for us today to have meaningful conversation. She got a standing ovation. Next day, the newspaper writes us up to say they showed up thinking there would be blood and guts in the library. And instead, there were people who were deeply engaged, thoughtfully engaged, and said later, this is what we wanted. We have such a thirst for deep and meaningful conversation about things that actually matter in our society. And so I suggest to you that rather than bowing away from controversy, this is the model. This is one of the ways that we stand up for intellectual freedom, not because we're fighting just for the hell of it, but we're fighting because our culture requires some sort of pattern that enables us to engage intelligently with one another. And so to wrap things up, we live in a time when public institutions are under attack. Never more so since 1938. And I think that the role of cultural institutions, memory institutions, is absolutely essential, not just as a form of resistance, although also as a form of resistance, but also as a form of understanding a positive role that we play. Institutions are valuable in our communities, in our culture. Too often, and increasingly, there will be greater and greater pressure that learning or the principle of investigation is too often compromised in the service of profit, in the service of powerful interests. And the best way to stand up to that is to not be standing up alone. To have an infrastructure of policy and procedure and a firm, ringing endorsement of a value that reflects the personal value that brought you to the field in the first place, but now becomes embedded within your organization. Too often, fear of controversy is used to silence us, is used to incorporate us into the service of people who are afraid. And we can be afraid or we can be courageous. A larger view is one of courage. We need institutions because otherwise powerful people roll over you, right? They can just bulldoze you into silence. Institutions give us a framework and a pattern that allows us to stand together and to be thoughtful and proud. And so I would just like to end this by saying we librarians think that the museums are our allies. Like us, you're in it for the learning. Like us, you're in it because you have questions and curiosity. And I want to remind you that you are surrounded by friends, surrounded by allies, and step into our community because we have much to learn from one another. So, if you are interested in further engagement with me, here's how to find me, jlarue@ala.org. And I would be most curious to hear about your thoughts about how we begin to take these common principles of intellectual freedom, embed them in our institutions, train up the next generations of librarians and museums to demonstrate civil and civic discourse and the courage to be bold, to be Americans. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jamie, for that really strong start to today's conference. At this point, we're going to take a short break, 5 to 10 minutes, to allow our next speaker to set up, and then we'll continue through to the end of the program. So back here at about 10 minutes. Thank you. Yes, we also have handouts available up in the middle of the room. We printed plenty, and what we're going to be talking about next is sort of a guide to how to create intellectual freedom principles in museums.
Good start.
Yeah.
We have to get into the computer.
Well done. Well, thank you for coming, David.
Hey, David, thanks.
Gotta get back for all of a sudden we're special now. Now that we've got you here.
Oh, whatever. How are you?
It's true.
I love how big you have that printed. I saw that from up there, and I'm like, oh, that's smart.
That's what I've got to do at this point. But I was constantly cutting pages as a
You
result.
couldn't even really see it because of the way the podium's built.
Our secret safe with me.
So, I'm a little disappointed in the turnout, but I think that the content is just fine.
That was spectacular, but everybody.
He and I have met a couple times in Chicago. The ALA offices are in Chicago. I go to Chicago often enough.
Yeah.
That we connect, and I think that we're going to, regardless of this start, he's really enthusiastic about taking this on the road.
Awesome. Yeah.
And talking about museums and libraries and principles of intellectual
Especially
freedom.
with the IMLS being cut.
Yeah, I mean, all of a sudden, this thing that just started as a topic of general inquiry a year ago has turned into...
Super relevant?
Yes, how about that?
Yeah. I'm excited for our trip.
Thank you for doing
Yeah,
that.
no problem. It's a long drive.
It is.
We'll have to make a couple stops, I'm sure, to stretch
And
it.
it's an early start.
I'm an early morning person. I get to work at 7 every day. So.
Once you get past
Before
that
the
thing,
sun's-
it's all an easy drive.
Yeah. What's the route that we're going to take?
See, up to Lansing, and there
Okay.
are 2 ways to do it.
Yeah.
I usually go over to Jackson and then up.
Yeah, I prefer that
And
route
then,
too.
okay, we'll do that, and then over to Grand Rapids, and then you go north for
Because
an hour.
23 has all kinds of construction on
Yep.
it still anyway.
Yep.
So. Okay, so then you go up north or you...
To Grand
To
Rapids.
Grand Rapids.
And then there's a north-south route you take up about
Is that
another
31?
hour. I don't know the number. I'm not good at stuff like that. But once you're off the expressway, it's about a mile, and then it's there.
Okay.
And the campus is small enough that it's sort of easy to get around.
Yeah, I've never actually been to that campus.
I've only been to the campus to go to the museum.
How many students are coming?
We're at 10 right now. The cohort's 12, but I've got 2 have already told me
They're not
that they won't be there. And I know that students tend to get
Yeah. Oh, come on. You should be excited.
I don't care if there's one. We're going.
All right. Sounds good to me. I'm fine with that.
I've been
I've never been, so I'm excited to do this.
really unique and the directors.
I'm excited to see how they're using it. What is the transformative point? What is that?
It's in the program.
Yeah.
It's not.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, I'm sure they do.
You see them. That is him
Plug in.
and his staff that really know what they're doing. All right, I gotta get ready for it.
Oh, does that go?
Thanks for that. Yep. Every time it's the way you did it initially. There you go.
Okay. Up.
You can just switch away.
Oh,
There you go.
good.
All right.
Perfect. And then I change.
And we'll switch. So this is the schedule. Just press VGA laptop when you come.
Okay.
All right.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right. You're welcome.
Jamie, that's your coffee? Probably. And that's your water, which I'm going to appropriate.
They have all been tested.
How'd you do last night? Okay.
I did try to find the Canada channel, but I
Couldn't. Explicitly.
no can't. Well, I mean, it goes through the like general networks and then the HBO.
Yes, it's being censored. Those Canadian viewpoints.
Contaminated.
It's reporting that properly. It used to be an open border. Okay, right. Yeah, but before, you still can see the wires, still get a number of Canadian channels on the radio.
Yeah. Canadian idea.
But if people come from someplace else, it seems it's others. Okay, let's get started with part 2 by allowing me to introduce our second speaker. Svetlana Mincheva is Director of Programs at the National Coalition Against Censorship, an alliance of U.S. national organizations committed to protecting freedom of speech. She's the founding director of NCA, the National Coalition Against Censorship's Arts Advocacy Program, the only U.S. national initiative devoted to the arts and free expression today. Mincheva has written on emerging trends in censorship, organized public discussions, and mobilized support for individual artists and others embroiled in censorship controversies. Her current research focuses on ethics and self-censorship within art institutions. With that as prelude, help me to welcome Svetlana Mincheva.
Thanks, Brad, and thank you, the Department of Museum Studies, for starting this important conversation. This is something that we've been doing kind of for a while, talking about how we can kind of proactively promote free speech. And we have, and I'll talk about some efforts we've had along those lines. But it's very good for the community to kind of like come together and amplify this and make it more of an organized effort. And we work a lot with the American Library Association, and I have to say librarians are our heroes because procedures or no procedures, you need an individual there, and librarians are maybe the most passionate pro-free speech defenders of intellectual freedom. And I have to say that we work in some states where the American Library Association is considered a kind of radical organization. Say, you know, our library should not be a member of those radicals, the ALA. They're not real Americans. They're too radical. So we encounter similar issues. We also work on book censorship cases. A lot of them not as successfully dealt with in schools as they are in public libraries because of this kind of assumption that parents should have control. And we have an interesting current case in Arkansas where a state representative has introduced a bill to remove all Howard Zinn, People's History of the United States, from school libraries, entirely from the state. So, you know, it's not only about sex and filth, it also is about politics, and I think the current atmosphere is encouraging the kind of political clampdown on ideas. So, okay, so I have to move to VGA laptop and not this. Okay, perfect. So I will talk a little bit about the sort of structures of the museums and that's kind of the structural restrictions that pose a challenge to free speech, and then walk you through some recent cases and controversies and how museums have responded, and then talk about initiatives that we have undertaken. And I hope you all have a copy of the Best Practices for Managing Controversy, a document we did with a number of other large national art service organizations. Brad mentioned ICOM, the International Council of Museums, and they have a wing which is I don't even know what the acronym stands for, CMAM, but it basically groups museum professionals globally. And they had a conference 2 years ago, the title of which was, Is the Museum Now a Place for Free Speech? Or has it ever been? So that is a question. It's not an assumption. When we kind of overcome the initial resistance to that, we think, on the one hand, what is the practice and what is the aspiration? But we also think of those other components of a museum's mission, like, preserving heritage, representing the community, collecting, exhibiting, interpreting visual art from around the world, challenging, inspiring, educating, serving as a gathering place for interdisciplinary discourse, for dialogue and community interaction. It's not quite the public square. There are specific goals that a museum has that are not necessarily just opening up to all. So how does free speech fit in all this? And what do we really mean when we're talking about free speech when this is about the museum, which has multiple consideration determining its programming? Its funding, its trustees, the community, social media today, and social media controversy. How do we think about free speech? So I would even, kind of go back a little bit in a consideration of what free speech, what does it mean to be free in a museum? What does it mean to have intellectual freedom? Because we can call it curatorial discretion, but the process of doing an exhibition does entail many decisions, which could sometimes look like self-censorship or sometimes even be self-censorship. And a question we can discuss is how we can draw the line between self-censorship and curatorial discretion. And contrary to libraries, museums have a limited number of shows a year, 5, 6, 10. But there are, there are shows that entail a lot of work. They entail fundraising. They entail complicated logistics, a legion of experts preparing an individual show. So you have to select artists. You can't just say, the community really would like to have a Kerry James Marshall show, and let's have it at our museum. You just can't do that outright. So you have to put a lot into it, which creates the impression, and it's not just an impression, of an affirmative agency. The museum, like in the library, you can have people say, we really are interested in having 50 Shades of Grey. But the museum has to make a decision. I'm going to have this show as opposed to another show, and I'm going to raise funds to have the show. And that kind of affirmative agency